Doug Kenrick, thank you so much for joining us today in this 25th anniversary of the first HBES.
Well, Barry, it's good to be here today in
Mm-hmm.
Miami Beach, Florida.
How was your flight in, sir?
My arms are tired.
Yeah, I was waiting for it. I set you up. We'll start off with a simple question. In what discipline did you earn your doctorate, sir?
I got my degree in psychology. My PhD was in social psych.
And when did you begin thinking about human behavior from an evolutionary perspective, and who or what prompted you to do so?
I was studying for my comprehensive examinations in social psychology, and I was supposed to be reading Fritz Heider and Leon Festinger and all the classic works in social psychology, and I have this proclivity when I have a lot of work to do to go buy a book on something completely unrelated. So I walked into the ASU bookstore and I saw a copy of a book called Primate Behavior and the Emergence of Human Culture by Jane Lancaster. And I picked it up and started looking at the chapters and noticed, well, these are a lot similar to the topics in social psychology. I bought the book, brought it home, and of course it had nothing to do with my comps, but she was raising this question of, can we consider humans in an evolutionary light? And I came to think this is what I should have been studying for my comps. And I was very, very influenced by that book. And in fact, I brought the book. I brought it to this young assistant professor, Ed Stadala, who later did some research with me on evolutionary social psych stuff. And I'm raving about it, and not a lot of the people in psych thought it was just a wacky thing to be thinking about. But Sadala had just got this book, this big thick book called Sociobiology.
Mm-hmm.
He showed it to me. I'd never seen it before, and he had an idea about how to study dominance and attraction in human beings because that was found in other primates, and he wanted to know, would we find this with humans? And so we did a series of studies, which eventually, like 10 years later, got published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psych, although we had a hard time publishing it originally. But that was my first serious move towards thinking about humans in evolutionary terms. To be honest, the background, when I was a kid, I raised tropical fish, and and if you read about tropical fish, the tropical fish magazines talk a lot about evolution and the adaptations that these fish have and so forth. And I started off majoring in biology, so I was prepared to take this tack. But social psych at that time had very little going on in terms of anyone thinking in terms of evolutionary.
Absolutely. Jane Lancaster, of course, will actually be interviewing for this project as well.
Ah, great.
Who were some of your, well, first off, was this a relatively intellectually lonely, isolated time for you? Did you have some key supporters, and if so, who were they?
Right, well, as I said, Sadala
Sure.
was the first person I spoke to. There was also on the faculty in environmental psych, along with Sadala, was a guy named Julian Edney, whose father was a famous biologist from South Africa. And Edney had us read like The Territorial Imperative and other books, which was a book that talked about human territoriality in adaptationist terms. And so Edney was pro-evolution. And there was no evolutionary psychology then. There wasn't even sociobiology then. But Edney was raised by an evolutionary biologist, and so he passed a lot of these ideas on, and they were probably important influences. But in the field of social psychology, there really was no. People looked at you like you had just joined some strange cult in those days.
Which is not entirely inaccurate.
Yes, right. It was a bit rough. Our first paper, the paper that Sadala and I sent in to the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, it got rejected. And one reviewer, who was a guy named Pepitone, who was thinking in evolutionary terms, he just said we should cite more primate work. But another reviewer said, and I remember exactly her words, I'm assuming it was a woman, as a feminist and a scholar, I feel duty-bound to protect the unwary journal readership from this type of inherently sexist scholarship. All we had said is that humans being primates, you would expect the same difference you find in other species, in which females are attracted to dominant males. When we published it 10 years later, we were told, oh, it's very timely. But when we first did it, it was really rejected on these kind of wacky political grounds.
I think modern day students probably don't fully appreciate the obstacles that people like you and others and pioneers of evolutionary psychology went through. Aside from what you've mentioned so far, are there any other notable obstacles you faced in pursuing your evolutionary informed behavior studies and publishing them?
I'd say there's sort of two sides to it. All psychologists believe in evolution.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to physical characteristics like the long necks on giraffes, no problems. When you start talking about the human mind, people were very, very reluctant because they had this idea that somehow the human mind is this big unprogrammed blank slate. And people still cling to that, even though they say they're not blank slate theorists because they know a little bit. They really are, and they want it to be a blank slate. And they think that somehow if the mind's a blank slate, then we can socialize people to be nice. And that's what psychologists like to do, especially clinical psychologists, but social psychologists as well. They think we want to go out and find out how to make people nice, how to raise kids so that they're nice. And so if you say people come with these inherent proclivities to act in certain ways, it's seen as genetic determinism.
Mm-hmm.
And people were very afraid of that. And it turns out that, as we know, it's all very interactive, and people are what they are. And we want the truth. If we actually want to change people, we ought to. But in those days, people just had this reaction, like if we don't talk about this stuff, then we can raise people to be nice. And so there was that, a lot of that. I mean, I had in the 1980s, then around the time that the paper with Sadala finally came out, I did something for Personality and Social Psych Review, which was then an annual edition, an annual book. And it was on gender. And one of the people on the editorial board, when this came out, wrote a letter to the editor of that annual edition, just basically squealing and screaming about how would you dare let this sort of thing in there? This is so, blah, blah, blah. It was just ranting and raving. And so we saw a lot of that. And then when Simpson and I, a couple of years later, were editing an edition of that. And from what I hear, and I don't have this on good authority, but that was the last time, they didn't do ours. The people at the publishing house, Sage Press, I think it was, said no to this particular topic, and they wanted us to change. They wanted someone else to do a different topic. And from what a guy who was big in the APA at the time said to me, it was because they didn't want to do something on sociobiology.
Wow.
And so we had to publish a separate book with another publisher.
Is this Evolutionary Social Psychology, the book?
It was the one that Simpson
Wow. I did not know that backstory.
Yes, it killed PSPR and turned it into a journal instead of an annual edition.
That's something I had no idea.
Yeah, because the people, this guy who I was speaking about, he said that they got very annoyed. The psychologists did get annoyed that the publisher was telling them that they couldn't publish this, and thought it did have some political background going on. So, there was a bit of that, and I remember getting kind of nasty faces from people. I talked to people at conferences, and just mostly kind of disbelief. Oh, this is useless, and then another reaction. Jim Sherman, a famous social cognition researcher, and a friend, but he said to me, "Look, Doug, if you want to study this sort of thing, why don't you switch your major to biology?"
Wow, that's something.
And kind of go out, get a pith helmet and go, study other animals, on the assumption that we can't study Homo sapiens. And we can't study the way Homo sapiens thinks, because what's the relevance? Even my friend David Funder, who has since come over to our side, as many people have, he had he was teaching at Harvard as an assistant professor and sat in on E.O. Wilson's class. Thought very fascinating stuff, but are there any hypotheses that we can derive about this? And yeah, right. So it was an interesting time.
I can't imagine. You mentioned a couple of your publications. Any of them in particular you think have had the greatest impact on the field?
I don't know if any of them have had great impact on the field in the way that, say, Lida Kosminides, who you talked to yesterday, has. But some papers I think have had some impact we had a paper, Rich Keefe and I had a paper in Behavioral and Brain Sciences on age preferences. The standard model in social psychology was that Well, the norms of American society specify that women should be less powerful than their husbands, and so women should be attracted to guys who are older, higher status, taller, larger, this sort of thing, and men should reciprocally be interested in women who are less educated, and younger. And lots of people had found that, in fact, marriages tend to be 2 or 3 years apart, and the man tends to be older, consistent with this. And people publish this again and again and again, and they often would say it's due to the norms of American society. They had never checked any other society. And Rich and I, we looked at, I gave a talk to some singles group, and they gave me a bunch of these magazines where people take ads, which everyone does now, but in those days it was a little more exotic to do that. But people took out ads, and they said, like, single, non-smoking, I'm 24 years old. I'm interested in people 24 to 30 or something along those lines. So we looked at the age of the advertiser and the youngest and oldest person. But what we did differently is, rather than just averaging all of the people together, we clustered them into decades. And what we found is that for people in their 20s, which is when most people are forming their initial mating relationships and ones they may stay with, there is about a 2 or 3 year spread. But for people in their 30s, there's a 4 or 5 year spread. And for people in their 40s, there's a big spread for the men. A man in his 40s is interested in women younger than him and only younger than him, on average. A man in his 20s is interested in a woman older or younger, has nothing against someone who is older than him. And really old men, they're advertising only for much younger women. And when we first presented that at the University of Michigan, some guy in the background said, that's just the norms of American society. And plus, it's what people want. They don't really get that. And we went out and collected data on actual marriages. And, well, it is what they get. The advertisements and the real marriage data match up perfectly. And then we went to other societies. And we found the exact same thing everywhere we looked in the world, that basically marriages, as men got older, they married progressively younger women in countries that had singles ads, which included India, where the family takes out the ad for you. As the man got older, his family advertised for a woman younger than him, and that increased with age. So we found it was universal, and we found that it wasn't true amongst young men. Another part of the story, which we published in another paper,
This is my favorite part. Keep going.
is that teenage boys. In fact, we started with my son Dave, and I asked him, what age would you be interested in dating? He said, I don't want to be one of your psychology studies. And I said, well, what about, he was 12 at the time. No, he was 13. And I said, well, what about a 9-year-old? He said, that'd be sick. Come on, that's perverted. And I said, what about a 12-year-old? Yeah, maybe. What about older? And he asked me this question that a lot of the teenage boys asked when we actually did a study. Is she interested in me? Because teenage boys know their mate value is low. And I said, she's fine. You can have any woman you want. You're like a movie star. Anyone you want, and your parents aren't going to object, no problem. He said, well, anywhere in the 20s would be fine for me. And what we found in general is that when we asked a large sample of teenage boys, the teenage boys were more interested in older women. And if they could have anyone they wanted, and we told them that you were infinitely attractive, and not infinitely, but that you're attractive and that the woman's going to say yes to you, they wanted college-age women, these 15-year-old boys. And that part, I think, really kind of put the nail in the coffin, because they're very sex-typed. So if it's sex-type, teenage boys are all into being macho. They wouldn't carry a purse if you paid them $50. I mean, the developmental psychologists have found that's the time when people are most sex-typed, and it's boys that are more sex-typed than anyone else, than girls. And yet these sex-type boys are interested they're violating the norm, because the norm is not what drives it. What drives it is an attraction, we believe, towards fertile females of high reproductive potential. And for teenage boys, that's older than them. For older men, that's younger than them.
This is one of my favorite findings discussed with my evolutionary psychology undergraduate students. To this day, with undergrads, it really brings home the evolutionary model.
Right. Well, one that I think is getting much more influential now is our work on fundamental motives and the kind of model of fundamental motives that evolutionary psychologists mostly believe that the mind is modular. And the question is, well, how many modules? Well, in social psych, people like to divide things into two piles, approach and avoid, positive, negative, heuristic versus systematic. And we've come up with this model that is based upon evolutionary thinking about the problems that people have, and we categorize the social problems that people have, and we've categorized them into, protecting yourself from the bad guys, making a group of friends, finding a mate, keeping a mate, caring for the offspring, and avoiding disease. And we don't necessarily believe the mind is cut up, like one of those butcher's diagrams into those sections. But I think if you categorize the problems that people think about a lot of the time, that captures a lot of it. And in fact, we were even able to sort of revise Maslow's pyramid, and that paper is seeming to have some impact very quickly, where people like that new way of thinking about Maslow's pyramid in an evolutionary frame. And my students have gone out and produced all kinds of lovely findings that if you activate these different motivational systems, you get sometimes very similar effects in men and women when you'd theoretically expect them. Self-protection, when the bad guys are up on the hill, everybody bands together, men or women. They conform more, they're friendlier, they're nicer, cooperative. And again, same sort of thing with men and women, they're more careful. Now you activate mating motivation, and as you'd expect from what we know about differential parental investment and sexual selection, now men and women start to play very different strategies. Now activate mating motivation, the men start acting like peacocks. They show off, they become more creative, they become more anti-conforming, they become more risky in making their economic decisions. Women go the opposite direction. They become a bit more cautious, they become friendlier and more group-oriented. So it's very nice because it shows the kind of split. Some similarities between men and women, where you'd expect, where the adaptive problem is the same, protecting ourselves from, it's like the baboons protecting themselves from the panther. They hang together, okay? Now it's mating. Now the males start peacocking and the females sit back and evaluate, or in humans show how nice and nurturant they are. So that, I think, has been a very productive. And the other thing, I think, you asked a question about what contributions. I think a lot of your contributions come through your students. And so I've had students who've come out of that lab, like John Maynor and Vlad Gruzkevicius and Jessica Lee and Jill Sunday and now Andrew White, Josh Ackerman, and these people have now gone off. They're conducting research programs on their own. They're extending the model into other aspects of life history, and that, I think, is that's I'm getting to now be carried on their backs, which is great.
Your intellectual progeny have been spread far and wide. Last I checked, I believe, in Buss's textbook for evolutionary psych, your research is cited more than anyone else.
Wow.
Yeah. Is there any contributions of note that you think didn't get the attention that you thought it should, at least thus far?
Well, the paper on the teenage boys doesn't get cited very much. We published it in, Rich Keefe wanted to publish it in a developmental journal, bring the message to a new group. Now, developmental psychologists are now discovering evolutionary psych, but when we published it in the 1990s, no developmental psychologist looked at it, and the social and personality and evolutionary people don't necessarily cite it either. It's part of our story, and I think like you know it, and people know it from my conference talks and all that, but that's a little bit of it didn't have an impact on developmental psych at that time. So that was one. Another aspect of the fundamental motives, I originally published that set of ideas, well, both in a textbook with Cialdini and Newberg, but published a psych review paper, which gets cited a little bit, but part of the argument in that is that each of these motivational systems involves an interesting kind of social dynamic and so we integrated dynamical systems theory into thinking, so I thought evolutionary biology, cognitive science, and dynamical systems theory, what a powerful sort of, an integration. And nobody pays any attention to the dynamical aspects of it. The paper doesn't get cited much by the people who study dynamics, and most people, dynamical systems are so hard to understand that I think evolutionary psych is kind of easy to understand because it's logical, straightforward. But dynamical systems are a little more complicated, and you start adding that to the mix, and even though I think it's how reality works, that basically we have mechanisms inside our head that are processing what's going on with other people, but then those other people respond to us, and you put a whole bunch of people together, and you start getting these interesting self-organizational processes occurring. And self-organization is different depending upon whether you're thinking mating, whether you're in a mating pool situation, whether you're in a kind of protecting yourself from the bad guys situation, in which case then you want a bigger group, and with mating, you want a different type of group, and that aspect of it, I think, no one's paid much attention to, and I was surprised. I thought that paper would get cited through the ceiling. The Maslow paper looks like it's taking off, because I think that's something everybody knows Maslow, they like Maslow, and thinking about him in modern evolutionary terms it seems to be having more impact than I thought it would have.
Up there with Pinker, Dawkins, Buss, and others, you're easily one of my favorite science writers alive.
Thank you.
Your latest book, Sex, Murder, and the Meaning of Life, hilarious, informative, about as good as it gets. But that being said, are there any papers, books, that if you had to do it all over, you would rewrite?
It's an interesting question. I remember you asked it, and I don't have any great answers
Skip
for
it. Yeah, no worries.
I never regret anything.
Well said. Many grad students watching this are surely going through a tough time. Can you think of any advice that you might give your former fledgling grad student self that might help the current generation?
Advice?
To get through the process.
Yes. I actually have something I put on the Psych Today blog, the Zen of Accepting Rejection, and I gave this talk at SPSB, and that was very well received by young people, because basically what I said is that, look, rejection is something that most smart young kids have never seen. The people that get into our graduate programs, I mean, they have extremely high SATs followed by extremely high GREs and extremely high grades at really good universities. When they write a paper for their teachers in high school, the teacher says, "Wow, did you really write this? This is so great." Then they go to college. They're better. They're a little better than average. Okay, there's a lot of smart kids, and they find those friends, but still, they're better than those. Even the smart kids, they know they're. Then they go to graduate school, and all of a sudden, they're just another smart kid, another really smart kid in a group of really smart kids, and then people start to shuffle in terms of who works harder, and and then you start getting feedback from professors that's a little bit more critical. You know what? Here's what I don't like about this paper that you just wrote. And they're preparing you for then when you send your journal papers in, people reject those. And it's universal. I mean, David Buss, Lita Cosmides, me, Martin Daly, all of these people that you're talking to have all seen a lot of rejection. And the story that I was telling is there's two very well-known psychologists, David Kenny and who's the other guy? Chuck, from this university. He does this sort of cybernetic stuff. Charles, I'm sure you know his name. Anyway, a very famous guy, and I'm blocking on his name right now. And they were having a conversation about how they handle rejection. And I thought, you guys get your papers rejected. We get our papers rejected all the time. And I thought that was a great message for me, because I had just received a whole bangload of rejections, and I was thinking maybe I'm in the wrong business. Well, if David Kenny, who's cited tremendously through the ceiling for his work, if he gets rejected all the time, then that says to me, this is normal. This is the way the business is done. People give you feedback, and you can either take that, throw the paper away and cry, or submit it to a lesser journal. Well, you'll get rejected anyway because you get the same reviewers. Or you can go back and do the work. You can read it as feedback, go back and do the work, and treat it as kind of useful information. That's what our game is about. The game of science is about not sending out false facts. And so there's a group of people that are journal editors that are in fact, they're more conscientious and careful than most. The ones and especially the ones that will take that job, are sort of these hardworking, meticulous, conscientious people. And so they want you to really rigorously turn over every stone. Once you realize that it's not something about you, and you learn to embrace rejection, then you can succeed in an academic career. And sometimes the rejection is baloney, and you learn how to argue it. You learn how to just say, okay, there's a bit of politics involved.
Absolutely.
To say something like, it was clear from the review process that we didn't really communicate. That the reviewers pointed out that we really weren't getting across our central message, so we restated it. in the following way. And then you always add a new study. We added a new study, and because you don't just want to argue with the editors, you want to
Mm-hmm.
you want to basically give them something back. And I think that's one of the biggest things. And hard work. It's tough, and enjoy it. I mean, that's the other thing. It's like work hard, but if this isn't the business for you, when I hear people, graduate students, say, I would like to have a life too. This should be your life. It's
Yeah.
fun.
Yeah.
It can be a lot of fun. It's thinking. It's what we're designed to do. The smartest kids in society, they're designed to think about big ideas. And so, treat it like you're playing a computer game. Treat it as fun. Don't study something if you're bored by it. Pick another more interesting topic. Enjoy it, but do a lot of it.
Mm-hmm.
Stick at it. And almost everybody. I mean, when our graduate students come in, they all think. I remember Vlad Griskevich was telling me, I'm not having any luck. I'm not getting any significant findings.
Wow.
And Bob Cialdini, who was his advisor, forgets this. But he said, I don't know about Vlad,
Wow.
And it turns out Vlad just stuck with it. Vlad
Yeah.
really stuck with it. And by the time he finished he was a little bit lucky. His first few papers to JPSP just got accepted, which never happens.
It was not, wow, outright accepted.
Outright accepted, yeah. The first two papers, and that never happens.
Mhm.
And so that is one of the critical things. What happens to you first? My first paper was rejected, and I could have easily, because I still, at this age, think, I don't need to do this anymore. People are rejecting me. And when you're young, if you haven't had many papers rejected, you think, oh, that's a sign of me. There's something wrong with me. And so learning to just sort of treat it like that's part of the game.
It's part of the process.
If you don't get rejected,
You're not a grad student.
yeah, you're not doing things right.
Another piece of advice a friend and colleague Todd Shackelford gave me on navigating rejections is to have a plan of attack before you even submit to that first journal of where you're going next.
Yeah.
And turning that paper around post-rejection, 24 to 48 hours. Because then you could just put that rejection to bed. Take the feedback you got, and if necessary, send elsewhere. And then have a plan of attack for stage 3 if need be.
Right.
That helps a lot too.
Yes. No. It is good to. It's good to have a plan of attack for rejection. And Todd has certainly published a few papers in his day.
Couple. So moving away from your research into the Human Behavior and Evolution Society itself, any contributions of note that you had to getting the society up and running back in 1989 or sometime elsewhere after it started?
None.
Is that right?
I didn't come to HBES until I asked David Butts this morning what my first HBES
Yes.
was, because he didn't. I told him it was at Michigan, and it was when Marty Hazelton came to apply there to work. He said, "Oh, that was '94." So I was a few years in. Some of my graduate students had gone to a previous HBES and told me it was great, but I didn't travel a lot in those days.
I see.
And so I actually wasn't there for the founding of HBES.
Gotcha.
I'm a late joiner.
Wow, that's surprising given that you were one of the early publishers in the actual field.
Right. Well, so I was publishing papers, but
Sure.
not actually involved with the sort of the in-group and I guess lately my biggest contribution is all of these graduate students
Right.
of mine who have become very active in HBS
Sure.
and have also brought it into social psych. I mean, they have the SPSB pre-conference, and a lot of my students have been involved in working that as well. So I guess I've had some contribution, I think, to the society, but it came later than the early founders.
So you first started attending in 94 or so, and for the most part, I imagine you've attended for the last 20 years or so for the most part. Have you noticed anything particularly surprised you in the evolution of HBES over the last 20 years or so?
I think the research has gotten better, more rigorous, more people have moved into lots and lots of different topics. I always thought, I mean, sex differences are easy. It's the low-hanging fruit.
Mhm.
The people who argue against the Clark and Hatfield finding, I don't know if they ever go out into the real world. Actually, they have another explanation of the sociology of science. I think that I won't go into it, but sex differences are so potent in mating behavior. It's like they're gigantic effects. They're easy to go after. And I think for years there's too much attention to that. And we still have we still keep finding them. But I think moving out into, taking these ideas into areas like cognition, and now we're going into economic decision making, and people are, there's been talks about development, and then thinking about life history development, these kinds of things. I think, I'm delighted to see that basically people are bringing evolution into all aspects of psychology. And it's nice for me to see that people in other areas, it used to be treated as some kind of strange cult, now it's treated like almost everybody in psychology is aware of evolutionary ideas and sees some applicability to them. It's not, you don't have the same kind of rejection that you did and that you do in some other disciplines.
Are there any directions you'd like to see HBES and HBESers pursue in the future?
What popped into my mind is more applications. It'd be nice to see, because psychologists, as I said before, like to go out and do good. Clinical psychology is, to a lot of people, they even think of maybe going to clinical psych. I was in clinical psych to start, and then I switched to social psych. And social psychologists want to help get rid of prejudice and do all these sorts of things in the world. And I think that, so Vlad and I just did this book on economics, and I think that economic decisions are part of everyday life, and we are getting more into that. But I think that the whole application of how everyday people really make those important economic decisions is worth knowing. I think applications to clinical psychology, applications to health psychology, they're there, but I don't think we push them as much as
marital therapy.
Yeah, precisely, exactly. It's understanding evolution would certainly help people in their relationships, I believe. And so I think that's something that we could become more involved in, bring in more kind of applied.
I concur. There's a burgeoning society, APES, AEPS, the Applied Evolutionary Psychological Society, that's looking to do precisely that.
Great.
And now that we have a good deal of the bedrock of the basic science, I think it's definitely high time we apply as well. So you've been attending for about 20 years. I know you met many of the prominent individuals that are no longer with us, people like George Williams, Bill Hamilton, Dave Rowe, Deb Singh, Margot Wilson, Linda Mealy. Any notable fond memories or anecdotes you can share about them with us?
Of those folks that you mentioned, I got to know Margot Wilson and Dave Singh probably the best. And Deb Singh was such an enthusiastic guy, and he was just such a sweet, warm, positive guy. In fact, my son Dave, when he was going to go study film at Texas, and he took us out to lunch to this Indian restaurant, and he was telling us about exactly, you should not mix the food like this, it's like Indians don't like to see the food. Well, it's okay, do it because you're not Indian, but and he just always had this great jolly sense of humor, and he was such a good guy.
I TA'd for him several times.
Did you?
He's about as funny as it gets in the classroom.
Is he? Yeah, no
and
surprise.
He's sorely missed.
Yes, right. You didn't mention David Rowe before, but David Rowe was actually a friend of mine.
Okay.
And he lived in Tucson.
Yep.
And I used to go down there and hang out with him. And the last time I saw him, I stayed overnight at his house and went for a long bike ride. He was a big bicyclist. And he had talked to me for years about doing a book that integrated behavior genetics, which is what he was trained in, with evolutionary ideas. And we never got to do it over the years, but he was a good guy, very good guy, and he was someone who was bridging the more somewhat proximate work on behavior genetics with the work on evolutionary psych, and he was getting into a lot of the things that, like Ellis and Figueredo, I'm sure he had some influence on their thinking, because the models that they're doing, he had published a couple of papers on the kind of thing that they're talking about now, and he was always extremely enthusiastic. Right, and I will not tell you my last story in any more detail. I'll get choked up, but he accomplished a lot in his relatively short life. I think he was in his 50s, early 50s when he
was missed.
Yeah. I remember one time, Martin and Margaret, I think, were staying at my house when they came to give a talk out there, and they brought me out bird watching. I'd never really gone bird watching, and they were keen into this particular kind of a shrike that kills little mice, and they hated this. They had this emotional reaction to the Shrike, and I remember about Margot that she was very enthused about this. Oh, there's one of those Shrikes, because it killed the animals that they had studied, these kangaroo rats, and I eventually got into bird watching. Was thought back to that, and thought back to sort of Margot was very into nurturing the field. I first met Margot at a conference in Texas that was put on by a social psychologist, and this was back in the 80s, and they brought together Martin and Margot were there, and there were some people like a philosopher who was interested in evolutionary theory, and there was yeah, a couple of other people, and I was immediately very impressed. I've always been impressed with their original book, Sex, Evolution, and Behavior, I think it was called, was just so full. Read it now, it's like they were so far ahead of their time in terms of really understanding a lot about evolution and kind of connecting it with human behavior in many, many different ways. And I often discover, and sometimes Martin reminds me of this, that he had this idea, that I thought I had some new idea, and it was actually in his book in the 1980s. And they were just amazingly thoughtful the way they went through so many aspects of human behavior and connected them to really solid evolutionary theory and the animal literature. And that's I'm still amazed at the knowledge of some of the people. One of the things that amazes me most about HBS, and has all the years, and it's not a change over time, but it's that I see more really raw IQ here than anywhere else that I go, actually. I mean, some really brilliant young and older people that are amazingly well versed. I mean, people like Lita Cosmides and John Tooby, they know so much about so many different things, and they really know what they're talking about. They've really seriously read a lot of anthropology and a lot of evolutionary biology and a lot of cognitive science, and it's sort of amazing. It's sort of, it really makes it makes me aware of what a great job it is to be in academia, because you get to earn as you learn. You get to keep learning throughout your lifespan, and then you look at somebody like Lita and you just think there's so much more that I can learn, that it's kind of fun. Sometimes it's fun to see somebody way ahead of you, because it gives you something to shoot for. And in this organization, there's so many intelligent ideas rumbling around. I see these young people and I think, I watch the talks here and I compare. I gave one of the plenary addresses, and I look at the students and think, oh, they did that better than I would do it. And so many of these young people are doing, they're telling the story in a logical, compelling way. And so it's a very impressive group of people, and it makes it fun.
Well, we'll wrap it up here. If I can do one plug for you, sir, The Rational Animal, the book you alluded to earlier with Vladas, coming out this fall, yes?
Yes, coming out. Actually, it's coming out before this fall. It'll be available on Amazon like the August 20th, and it's going to be in the bookstores by September 10th. September 10th is the official date, but it'll actually be available in many places before that.
Pre-order it
At a
now.
bookstore near you.
Thank you so much, Doug. I really appreciate your time.
Okay, thank you.